Something a little bit different today. We're going to take a step back through time. Welcome to the Highland Folk Museum near Newtonmore in the Highlands of Scotland. So what is the Highland Folk Museum, I hear you all ask? Well, it's Britain's first ever open-air museum. And it can trace its roots back over 100 years. But in its present location, it's been here since the 1940s. And it covers the best part of 80 acres, where there are 3 villages, which are from the 1700s, the 1800s, and the 1900s. And they literally take you back through time, and you can learn all about the Highland way of life. Oh, and it's also an Outlander filming location. I'm going to start by heading to the oldest part of the site, which is this area here called Pinewoods, which is very apt given it's a pine tree forest. Now there are quite a number of little carvings. We've got a little deer here. There used to be a lot more trees here, but we had a big storm back in 2022 which resulted in a huge amount of devastation, not just here, but throughout the north of Scotland. And at this site, it was very, very badly damaged. Several of the exhibits, unfortunately, were hit by falling trees. So there's been a huge clear-up process over the last 12 months, and they're slowly getting there. And look at that for a beautiful owl carving. Just over here is potentially Scotland's last wolf. That's one thing about coming to Scotland. You don't have to be afraid of being killed by bears or wolves or any other wild animals. We killed our last wolf in the 1700s, in fact, in this very area. And we killed our last bear probably around about 1,000 years ago. I think this little fella here, I think this is a pine marten, which is a little vicious little animal that lives in forests in Scotland, in the Highlands in particular. And it will literally eat anything. It will raid birds' nests, it will raid your chicken coop. It's kind of like a tree climbing fox, would be the best way of describing it. Oh, and I also have to say, I got something wrong in the introduction. Talking to one of the staff here, I thought they'd moved to this site in the 1940s, but it turns out in the 1940s they moved to a site a couple of miles up the road from here. This site they actually got in the early 1980s, so mea culpa. So this is us making our way up to the old township, which basically is how a Highland village would have looked back in the 1700s. All the houses are all constructed in the original way, timber framed, using local materials and using the traditional building methods with the traditional tools. They use turf, they use grass, they use earth, they use peat, they use timber, they use moss, and they use reeds as well. And this house here is the house of the most important person in the village. But look at that for a view. You would literally think that you've just walked back 300 years in time. It's quite incredible. And they've done such an exceptional job. And I'm sure some of you may well recognise it from Outlander as well, season 1. So this is the tackman's house. And the tackman, it's a Gaelic word, and it comes from the word fair tack, which literally translates as the supporting man, because the tackman was often a relative of the clan chief, usually educated and understandably had one of the best houses in the village. So 1700s opulence at its best, complete with a peat fire and no chimney. I've got to watch how much talking I do when people are having conversations and such like, but it's pretty quiet today. It's October. the site closes at the end of October, but it really is quite something. You really can imagine Highland way of life back in the day. So as I said, it was used as an Outlander filming location in season 1. If you remember the season, the episode where the Mackenzies are collecting rent, this is the village that they come to collect the rent, and Claire falls out with the person in charge because he's going to take away a goat, which is going to deprive a young child of milk. And also she has an introduction with one of the redcoat officers who's working as a blacksmith in one of the buildings. In fact, this building, I think right here. And he comes over to ask if Claire is okay. But it's quite incredible to think that just 300 years ago, this is how people lived in the Highlands. This room's set up with a very old-fashioned loom for weaving. So this is how they would have made fabric back in the day. They wouldn't have made tartan like we imagine it today, or like it is today. It would have been much plainer, using local dyes to distinguish different areas, different clans, different families. But all the villages would have had little weaving looms where people would literally have hand weaved fabric. And you can also see how these buildings were constructed. So they would weave branches, often willow because it was fairly flexible. They'd weave it together, and then they'd often spread mud, what we would call wattle and daub. Often as well, what they would do is they would make bricks out of peat, and that's exactly what that is. So that's peat, which is decayed organic material, vegetation, thousands of years old. You would cut it into bricks, you would dry it out, and then you would use it to make a building. Because there are not substantial clay deposits in this part of Scotland, so you didn't have the option to potentially make your own bricks. And they would also use peat as a source of fuel for heating. So this room's set up as a little storeroom with an old-fashioned plough, an old set of ladders, and probably some sort of quern stone there as well, where you would grind your grain to make flour. But it gives you a real insight into how life would have been back in the early 1700s, a tough way of life, especially in winter. Unbelievable how tough people were back then, but you didn't have any choice. It was survival of the fittest. Now this building over here, this is the back of the TACman's house. So he's the one who was kind of in charge. TACman comes from the Gaelic fair tac, which means supporting man, because he was often a relative of the clan chief, and he was responsible for raising taxes, for organising the village. And he was fairly educated, and this would have been the best house in the whole village. So this was 1700's opulence back in the day. You can see the fire, no chimney, it's just going up through a little vent in the roof. It's working quite well, but I'm breathing the smoke in, that's for sure. And the furniture, all very basic. The floor would just be soil or clay, and if you were really lucky it would be paved and often half of the house the animals would be in, partly for security, for safety, because you didn't want people stealing your animals, but also it was practical because the animals would help to heat the house, especially in the winter time. So often it was a 50-50 house. The humans slept in one half and the animals slept in the other half, which was called the byre. You can only imagine what the smell must have been like. I have to say I really, really love this kind of museum, and I think there's so few people who know about this place. I think the name confuses a lot of people because it's called the Highland Folk Museum, and I think a lot of people think folk as in folk music. But, as you can see, it's absolutely nothing to do with music. It's all about the Highland way of life. And what better way to learn it, and for kids to learn about it, than to touch it, to feel it, to get in it, to jump all over it. Well, not literally jump all over it, but you know, it takes literally no imagination whatsoever to think exactly what this place would have been like back in the 1700s. I mean, it really is like we've just stepped back in time. Unbelievable. So if you are passing through Kingussie, Newtonmore, you're heading up the A9 between Perth and Inverness, you've got to stop here because it is incredible. You don't have to be an Outlander fan. If you're interested in history, culture, and just learning more about the Highland way of life, then it really is unmissable. Right, we'll go and have a look at some of the other parts of this little 80-acre site. Let's go for a wee look inside this building, which has got two doors. Now the doors, you'll notice, are tiny. You know, they're about 5 foot if you're lucky. And part of the reason for that is people were very small back then. But the other reason is that the door is where you lost all your heat. So you didn't want it to be too big because it would be drafty and it would be cold. So it makes a lot of sense. Let me just put my torch on, see if we can get a better bit of filming in here. Well, it gives you an idea of just how dark and gloomy it would have been. Most of these houses didn't have windows because glass was incredibly expensive, but it was also a way again of losing heat. So if you didn't have a window, you didn't have a draft, and you didn't lose heat out your window. So when they did have windows, often they were just wooden shutters that could be opened and closed, and they could be padded. But you can see the way that the roof's constructed. Big wooden beams supported on top with smaller sticks, and then in between there's moss, and then on top of that there is thatch. So, and often they'd use turf and grass as well. And some of the utensils of the period, wood-turned ladles and bowls. They'd weave baskets from materials as well. Little brushes for cleaning the floors. There's all your wood-turned bowls for eating, for cooking, for drinking. And they would use, they would make ladles and cutlery by using knives to carve them, some wood carving. Also a wee wooden cup as well. Let's have a wee look in the other half of this building, which, if I remember rightly, is an animal pen, what we call a byre. So there's a little pen here made of stone, which is where you'd maybe shear the wool off the animals or such like. You'd use it as a temporary holding pen, maybe if there were baby cows, calves or lambs or such like, to keep them safe. And you might also remember the scene in Outlander, which is shot here, which is Claire doing what's called walking wool, which is where they sit round a table and they sing a song and they pass these big balls of wool around. Now the problem with the wool is that in order to treat it, you used to use human urine before you worked the wool. So here we are. This is part 2 of the house, and that is exactly what it is. It's an animal byre. So you can see there's a couple of stone stalls in here, so this is maybe where you would keep a couple of pigs or a couple of cows at certain times of the year, or for safety, or if there's inclement weather, or if they're calving or giving birth. And again, another little pen just next door as well for smaller livestock, or where you could store equipment, and that goes directly into the stone little compound outside, what we would call an animal enclosure. Fantastic. In the summer months they often have little events here. They have people dressed up in costume. There's lots of interactive things for kids and for adults, so you can practice wood turning, you can grind corn to make flour and wheat to make flour and so on. There's little outdoor spaces that they use as well for people to experience life in the 1700s. Over here's like a little outdoor education area that they often use for school groups, where they can sit under cover if it's raining. It is Scotland after all, and they can learn a little bit more about the various ways of Highland life and culture. So here you can dress yourself up in the traditional plaid or the great kilt. So you can wrap that round you. You need to pleat it yourself and literally put yourself in it. And then you've got some of the tools of the trade. This is a targe, which is a leather fronted wooden shield, and this is the type that the Highlanders would have used at Culloden. Obviously it wouldn't do very much if someone's firing a bullet at you, but it would give you some protection against a bayonet or a sword. And they would put leather on the outside. They would decorate them with studs, copper and brass studs. So yeah, no match for a musket though. This is the final little building, and it's a really interesting building because this is a drying room. This is where they would take the corn or the barley or the wheat or whatever crops they're growing to dry it out. So if we come in through this tiny little door, it's partially stone floored, and this here is where they would light the fire, and then they would use it. There would be a platform here where they would lay down. You see that wooden wicker basket looking thing, so they would lie that down and they would lie the grain on top of it to dry out the barley or the corn. And also, I'm told, this is where they would do some whisky distillation. Scotland with a very long history of whisky production. So that's me leaving the village, should I say. And apparently today they've got a wee display on, and they have this little pond here. This is for a type of craft which is called a coracle. And this is a really, really ancient way of people getting around back, well, as far as probably humans have existed. They would make these little baskets, they would weave together material, and they would treat the timber, and they would put a little board across the middle, and it would allow you to paddle on rivers or lochs, just one person. As you can see, pretty not exactly health and safety conscious, but clearly this man is doing pretty well. And as I say, the coracle is a means of transport on water that goes back thousands and thousands of years. So what did you think of that? Pretty impressive, I'd say. So well worth a visit if you're in the area between Perth and Inverness. A little place called Newtonmore, which is near Ruthven Barracks or Ruthven Barracks, if you've seen that video that I'm going to be posting. And well worth a visit. I'm going to show you a couple of the other sites just quickly, in some of the more modern villages, but I think the 1700s village is pretty incredible. It should say they take donations for entry, so it's a couple of pounds to park in the car park with coin or card, and they take donations for entry. They suggest around about 10 or 12 pounds per adult if you're able, but give as much as you're able to give. There's a cafe, there's toilets, restrooms, a little gift shop, and there's a lot of things to do. There's a little play park for kids, and lots of things to explore, so well worth a visit. Right, let's go and have a look in this building here. All the buildings on the site, apart from the 1700s village, they're all original buildings. So this one, Fraser and Company, joiners. So these buildings have been rescued from all over the Highlands. They were literally falling apart or going to be demolished. And the museum takes them down and then rebuilds them, literally brick by brick or plank by plank, and shows exactly how they would have originally looked back in the 17, 18, 1900s. I think the most modern building they have is in the 1950s. But effectively there's three villages, 17, 18 and 1900s. You can imagine all the men in here, maybe a few women too, doing all kinds of joinery, building, making furniture, agricultural equipment and so on. And all of the machinery, the lathes and the bandsaws, were all powered with pulley systems. And you'll see the big belts here running down into the basement, which is where the mechanism would have been to drive all this machinery. Health and safety was not quite as it is today, that's for sure. There's a couple of wee buildings here. The one on the right, the cream coloured cottage, that's the Tweed Shop, so the fabric shop. And the green one on the left, that's the tailors. So these are both original old cottages, old premises, where you would have gone to buy your fabric or your clothing. So this one, D. Macpherson, tailor and outfitter. Open. The old shop front. This is where you would meet your customers, discuss their requirements, sell them their buttons or whatever else it is that they were after, their threads and so on. And through here is the sort of living workshop sort of area with the old stove, the little table where you can cut your materials and you can do all of your measuring and all of your stitching and sewing. And on the other side of the road is the Tweed Shop. And in here there's yet another old-fashioned mill. The loom, as we would call it. So that's where they would loom or mill the tweed, which is one of the fabrics of choice in the Highlands, which has got its roots in Harris tweed, which is famous all around the world. So this is where you'd come and you'd pick your fabric or just buy off the shelf if it was already made. And in the back is the office, complete with telephone and all the books, all the order books, all the phone numbers and so on. And this one and the one across the road I think are from around about the 1950s period. But quite something. This wee building up on the hill, this is an old church, a tin church. So it's made of corrugated iron. And this one is called the Lallybroch Mission Church. And Lallybroch was actually just by Culloden battlefield at Inverness. So this is where this church is from. And it is indeed. Leannoch Mission Church was originally situated near Culloden battlefield, where it served both the Church of Scotland and the Free Church congregation, built around 1900s. So there you are. And there we go. And these corrugated iron buildings were very, very common in the Highlands in the late 19th and early 20th century. That would be the pulpit. You've got the piano and the organ as well. And then through here would be the little administration room, where the minister would probably organise his sermons and so on. But if it wasn't for places like this, then this building would never have survived. It would have been demolished and would be no more. But traditionally in the Highlands, huge amount of buildings were made of corrugated iron, and as you can imagine, they don't survive particularly well. So this is a very rare survivor. And up here on the right is another old corrugated building, another old tin building. This is the old school. It's called the Knockbane School. And through the summer months and the busier times of year and the weekends, they have an actual school teacher here who can talk you through how lessons would have been carried out back in the 1950s or thereabouts. Who knows, for some of you this might look very familiar. I certainly recognise the desks. I remember having desks like this in the 1980s. In fact, I tell you what, it says a typical timetable in the 30s and 40s, so it looks like this building is 10 or 20 years old than I remember. Morning prayers, Bible study, checking the homework. Oh, who remembers that? Homework, wow. Arithmetic, interval playtime, 20 minutes, wow. Multiplication, English, grammar, lunch, 1 hour for lunch, spelling, handwriting, geography, history, art, music, nature, sewing, all squeezed into 1 hour. Reading for half an hour, selling of homework. Don't know, do you think you can sell your homework? And then 4 o'clock, the end of school. But there will be physical education for short periods as well, depending on the weather, because it was probably done outside. So yeah, how many of you remember an old schoolroom like this, I wonder? With a great big stove there as well for the teacher to make their cup of coffee or cup of tea. And off to the side, the old pommel horse for gymnastics, and also the sinks for washing your hands, with the restroom and the cloakroom directly behind me. This little building here, this really reminds me of my great aunt and great uncle who lived in the Highlands in a very traditional old croft. This is a croft house. This is the traditional type of house that the Highlands people used to live in through the 18 and 1900s. And my great aunt and great uncle, their father and grandfather built the house that they lived in. And originally it would have been thatch, and later it was replaced with a slate roof. So I used to visit a house not too dissimilar from this when I was young, growing up, going up to the Highlands. So again, it's a thatch roof. You can see though it's made more with stone rather than peat and grass and earth, with a little outbuilding to one side for storing your agricultural tractor, machinery, plough and so on, and a little enclosure to the left hand side for your sheep, your lambs and so on. And a very small doorway, 5 foot give or take, takes you into the kitchen. So this is exactly what my great aunt and uncle's kitchen was like. Unbelievable that they lived like this as recently as 15 years ago. And then off to the left would be the sitting room, which is where what you would call the living room, with the open fire they did have a little bit more luxury than this, but originally this is exactly how the house would have looked back in the day. And then on the opposing side is the bedroom, which would have an open fire and a very basic bed. Thank God for double glazing, plasterboard, insulation and so on. I don't think we could all live like this these days, could we? This is an old shepherd's bothy of the type that would have been in the Highlands, just temporary buildings that were used seasonally. And there's a little, what we call a sheepfold, that little wall there, which is where you shear your sheep and you do lambing and so on. And down here are two very cute Highland cows, who are both unfortunately facing away from us. But we'll see if we can lure them over. But this cute little pair are called Lucky and Sprout, and one of them certainly has appeared in previous videos of mine before. But well, they're not looking very enthusiastic today, I have to say, which is surprising because normally they get a bit lazy when it's cold, when it's warm, but when it's cooler. It's only about 10 degrees today, which is 50 Fahrenheit, so nope, a definite I am not interested. So the Highland cow is the oldest breed of cattle in the world, and it is perfectly suited to living in Scotland. A big thick coat that keeps it cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Well, that's as far as I'm going to go, but as I say, it is a place well worth a visit. The best part of 80 acres. Pick a nice day. Come when it's sunny and warm. It does happen in Scotland. You can see here there's a big adventure play park for the kids to keep them entertained. The big white building beyond, down on the bottom right hand side, is the gift shop. And above that is the cafe, where they do soup and sandwiches and home bacon, tea and coffee. And then the little building off to the left is the restrooms and toilets. So I highly recommend it. And as I say, it's on a donation basis, so pay as much as you're able to help support this fantastic place. So I hope you enjoyed this little trip back through time, and maybe for some of you it was a little trip down memory lane. Well, if you like what you see and you're not already subscribed, then please hit that button, and hopefully I'll see you all on my next virtual tour. Take care, and thanks for watching. So where is the Highland Folk Museum? Well, welcome to Scotland, and ignore the blue dot because that's where I am. But you'll see in the north is Inverness, to the south is Perth, and between the two is a road known as the A9, which is the main highway through this part of the Highlands. And you'll find the Highland Folk Museum between Newtonmore and Kingussie.